My name is Marcus Webb. I am 54 years old. I live in a house in Nashville, Tennessee that I designed myself, not because I am an architect, but because by the time I could afford to build it, I had spent enough years understanding exactly what I wanted that I did not need someone else to translate it. 3 bedrooms, a big kitchen, a workshop in the back where I still go on Saturday mornings and build things with my hands even though I do not need to anymore. I drive a truck. Same brand I have driven since I was 22. Different truck now obviously, but same brand, because when you find something that works you do not switch it out to prove a point. I wear regular clothes. Not because I cannot afford the other kind, because regular clothes are what I have always worn, and the day I start dressing differently to communicate something to someone is the day I have become someone I do not want to be. I built a company. Started it in my garage when I was 31 years old with $14,000 I had saved over 6 years of working a job I was not passionate about, but that I showed up to every day without complaint because the job was the vehicle and the savings were the destination. The company made tools, not the hand tools that my grandfather used, software tools. Specifically, project management and workflow software for small and medium-sized construction companies, which was a market that the big software companies had looked at and decided was not worth the specific complexity of serving, because construction companies were not like other businesses, and their needs were not like other software users, and the investment required to understand those needs deeply enough to serve them correctly was more than the projected return justified. I disagreed with that calculation. I had worked in construction for 3 years before I went into software. I understood the needs from the inside. I understood what foremen actually needed when they were standing on a job site, and what project managers actually needed when they were managing 7 things simultaneously, and what owners actually needed when they were trying to understand whether they were making money or losing it on a job that felt busy but whose numbers were unclear. I built for those people. I built because I understood them. And because I understood them, I built something they actually used. The company was called Fieldline. You may have heard of it. If you work in construction, you have probably used it. Fieldline went public on the New York Stock Exchange in March of 2019 at a valuation that the financial press described as impressive for a company of its size and age, and that I described, in the single interview I gave that day, as the natural result of solving a real problem for real people over a long period of time. The valuation was $53 million. The IPO raised $21 million in fresh capital. My personal stake, after the offering, was worth just under $30 million. $30 million. That is the number. I am going to tell you how I got there. But first, I want to tell you about the Thanksgiving in 2009, when my brother Kevin stood up from the table and said the thing that I have thought about almost every day since. He said, "Marcus, I love you, man, but you are wasting your life in that garage and everyone here is too polite to say it except me." He said it with his fork in his hand and turkey on his plate, and the specific confidence of someone who had a good job with a salary and benefits and a 401k, and who had decided that because his path looked stable from the outside, it was therefore the correct path for everyone. He said it in front of my mother, in front of my sister, in front of my aunt and uncle who had driven 4 hours to be there, in front of his own wife, who did not disagree with him but also did not agree, which in the specific language of silence was the closest thing to kindness she was capable of in that moment. I put down my fork. I looked at Kevin. I said, "Okay." One word. I picked my fork back up. I ate my turkey. And I went back to the garage the next morning and I worked. For 10 years I worked. And then in March of 2019, I sat in a room on Wall Street and watched a number go up on a screen, and I thought about Kevin's fork. I thought about my one word. I thought about 10 years of mornings. And I felt something that was not quite pride and not quite satisfaction and not quite vindication, but was somewhere in the specific territory where all three of those things overlapped. 3 weeks after the IPO, Kevin showed up at my front door. He was not alone. He brought my sister. He brought his wife. He brought a list of things he wanted. I had a different kind of list ready. But before any of that, I need to take you back to the beginning. To a boy in Louisville, Kentucky. To a father who worked 2 jobs and never once said it was too hard. To a garage and $14,000 and a problem that nobody else wanted to solve. Like this video right now, if you have ever been told by someone you loved that what you were building was a waste of time, hit that button because you know exactly what this story is. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. Every week there is a story here worth your time. I promise you that. Comment below and tell me, who was the person who told you that you were wasting your life? What did you say back? Tell me everything. We are starting from the very beginning. Louisville, Kentucky. My father, James Webb, was the hardest working man I have ever known. I do not say this as a tribute or as the kind of thing sons say about fathers, because it is expected. I say it as a specific observational fact that I arrived at through years of watching him, and that I have never had any reason to revise. James Webb worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood. During the day, he worked at a printing company on the east side of Louisville. He operated a large format press for 9 hours a day, 5 days a week, and had done so since he was 23 years old. The work was loud and physical, and required a specific combination of technical precision and sustained attention that most people who had never operated industrial equipment did not fully understand when they imagined it. In the evenings, 3 nights a week and both weekend days, he did maintenance work. Not for a company, on his own. He had built a small client base of rental property owners in the Louisville area who paid him to fix the things that broke in their properties: plumbing, electrical, drywall, appliances, whatever needed doing. He had learned most of these skills from his own father, who had been a general contractor, and he had continued learning from every job he took because every job revealed something the previous one had not required. He never complained about the 2 jobs. Not once that I heard. This was not because he was performing contentment. It was because he had a specific relationship with work that I only fully understood when I was in my own garage at 31, working 16 hours a day on something that was not yet paying me anything, and finding that the hours did not feel like hours in the way that the people around me seemed to think they should. Work was not separate from life for my father. It was not something he did to fund the real living. It was itself a form of living, the specific engagement with a problem and the satisfaction of resolving it that gave the day its shape and its meaning. I inherited this, or absorbed it, or both. I was the oldest of 3 children. Kevin was 2 years younger than me. My sister Patricia was 4 years younger. We grew up in a house on Shelby Street in a Louisville neighborhood that was working class in the honest sense, which meant that the people in it worked, and that the work was visible, and that nobody on the block was pretending to be something other than what they were. My mother, Dorothy, taught 4th grade at a public school 6 blocks from our house. She had taught there for 22 years by the time I graduated high school. Her students called her Miss Webb and remembered her years after she had taught them because she had the specific quality of a teacher who looked at each child as an individual problem to be understood rather than a unit to be processed through a curriculum. She brought this quality home. She looked at her 3 children the same way. Kevin had a gift for numbers. She found the right math program and put him in it. Patricia was an artist from the time she could hold a crayon. Dorothy kept every drawing, framed the best ones, and never once suggested that art was not a serious pursuit. I was different from both of them in a way that Dorothy had noticed early and that she described to me once, when I was about 40, and we were sitting on her porch and talking about the early years, as a specific hunger for understanding how things worked. She said, "You were never satisfied with the result. You always wanted to see the mechanism." She was right. From the time I was 7 or 8, I was the kid who took things apart. Not destructively, with intention. I took apart a broken radio when I was 8, not to fix it but to understand it. I spread the components across the garage floor and I looked at each one, and I tried to understand what it did and how it related to the ones next to it, and what the whole system was trying to accomplish. My father found me there one Saturday afternoon. He sat down on the garage floor next to me. He did not say, "You should not have taken that apart." He said, "What do you understand so far?" I told him what I had figured out. He added to it. He explained the parts I had not understood. He did this for 45 minutes, sitting on the garage floor in his work clothes on a Saturday afternoon when he had other things to do. At the end, he said, "Now you know how to put it back together." I said, "Does it matter? It was already broken." He said, "It matters because next time you see one working, you'll know what's happening inside it. That's always worth knowing." I have thought about this conversation more times than I can count. The idea that understanding a broken thing was valuable not because you could fix it, but because the understanding itself was the point. That the knowledge of how something worked was worth acquiring regardless of the immediate practical application. This was the foundation. Everything I built later was built on this foundation. Kevin did not have the garage floor instinct. Kevin was drawn to the finished thing, not the mechanism, the result. He liked numbers because numbers produced answers, and answers were complete in a way that mechanisms were not. A mechanism always led to another question. An answer led to the next problem, which was different. This was not a criticism of Kevin. It was an observation. Kevin's brain was a specific shape and mine was a different specific shape, and both shapes had value in the world. The problem was not the shape of Kevin's brain. The problem was what happened to Kevin's brain over time. Kevin was the kind of student that teachers celebrated without fully understanding, which was a student who produced correct answers on every assessment and who moved smoothly through the educational system, because the educational system was designed to produce correct answers on assessments, and Kevin was very good at this. What Kevin was less good at, and what the educational system was not designed to test for, was the ability to function in the absence of a known correct answer, to look at a situation that had not been categorized, and to build a framework for understanding it from the available materials. Kevin got his accounting degree from the University of Louisville. He got a job at a mid-sized firm in the city immediately after graduation. He was reliable, accurate, and excellent at his specific function. He was also, from fairly early in his adult life, someone who had concluded that the path he was on was the correct path, and that paths that diverged significantly from it were therefore in some way incorrect. This conclusion was not stated, it was lived. It showed up in the way Kevin talked about people who had left stable jobs to pursue uncertain things. It showed up in the specific kind of concern he expressed when someone he knew made a decision that looked risky. It showed up, eventually, in the way he talked about me. Patricia was different from both of us. She had gone to art school, which the family had supported with varying levels of enthusiasm, and had built a career as a graphic designer in Columbus, Ohio, where she had moved in her mid-20s, and where she had a good life and a small studio apartment and a cat named Gerald, and a circle of friends who were interesting and slightly chaotic in the way that creative communities were. Patricia and I had always understood each other. Not because we were the same, because we both had the experience of building something that the people around us did not immediately recognize as valuable, and of having to hold our conviction about the value in the face of that non-recognition. She had her own version of the garage floor. She had defended it. She understood what I was defending. When Kevin made his speech at Thanksgiving in 2009, Patricia did not agree with him. She also did not contradict him at the table. She called me the next day. She said, "Marcus." I said, "I know." She said, "He doesn't understand what you're building." I said, "He doesn't understand that he doesn't understand it. That's the specific problem." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I was back in the garage by 6 this morning." She said, "That's what I figured." She said, "For what it's worth, I think you're going to be fine." I said, "I know." She said, "You always know. That's what drives Kevin crazy." This was true. It was also the thing that made the 10 years survivable. I need to tell you about the 3 construction years, because they are the reason Fieldline exists in the form it exists. After I graduated from the University of Kentucky with a computer science degree in 1990, I did not go into software immediately. I want to be specific about why. It was not because software jobs were unavailable. They were available, and I had been recruited for 3 of them by the time I graduated. It was because I had spent 4 years studying the mechanisms of software, and I had reached a conclusion that I had not expected to reach. I did not yet know what problem I wanted software to solve. The people going into software jobs directly from college were going into roles where the problem was already defined and they were being hired to implement the solution. This was valuable work. It was not my work, not yet. I needed to find the problem first. I took a job with a construction company. Specifically, I took a job as a field coordinator for a mid-sized general contractor in Louisville called Hartley Construction. The job involved being on job sites and managing the flow of information between the site teams and the office. Schedules, material orders, subcontractor coordination, daily progress reports. The job was a specific kind of education that no computer science program offered. I saw, in my first week at Hartley, the single most important thing about the construction industry that the software companies who had tried and failed to serve it had missed. The problem was not that construction companies did not have enough data. The problem was that the data they had was in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the wrong format, for the people who needed it. A foreman on a job site had information about what was happening on the ground that the project manager in the office needed to make decisions. But the foreman's information existed in his head and in handwritten notes on a clipboard that might reach the office at the end of the day if nothing more urgent came up. The project manager in the office had scheduling information and budget information that the foreman on the ground needed to make real-time decisions. But that information existed in spreadsheets and printed documents and phone calls that the foreman had to interrupt his actual work to receive. The gap between the ground and the office was not a technology problem. It was an information flow problem. And the specific shape of the information flow problem in construction was different from the shape it took in any other industry because the construction environment was different. The site changed every day. The team composition changed between jobs. The relationship between the schedule and the actual conditions on the ground was constantly being renegotiated by weather and material delays, and the specific unpredictability of working with multiple subcontractors who each had their own constraints. I worked at Hartley for 3 years. I asked questions every day. I talked to foremen. I talked to project managers. I talked to owners. I talked to subcontractors. I talked to the people in the office who processed the paperwork and who could see the full picture more clearly than anyone, but who had the least authority to change anything. At the end of 3 years, I had a very clear picture of the problem. I left Hartley. I took a software development job at a mid-sized tech company in Louisville. I spent the next 6 years learning the software development side of the solution, building things, understanding the architecture of platforms that managed complex information flow, learning what was possible and what was expensive, and where the costs could be reduced without sacrificing the capability. I saved money, $14,000 over 6 years. Not because I was paid poorly, I was paid adequately. Because I lived the way my father had lived, which was on what was necessary and to the side with the rest, because the rest had a destination. In 2001, at 31 years old, I left the tech company. I drove home. I pulled into the garage. I set up a folding table. I opened my laptop. I started building Fieldline. The name came from a conversation I had with one of the Hartley foremen in my second year there. His name was Douglas Merritt. 50 years old when I knew him, had been in construction since he was 19, the kind of man who could look at a foundation pour and tell you before the concrete set whether it was going to be straight or whether there was going to be a correction conversation later. His hands knew things his brain had stopped having to consciously process 20 years earlier. Douglas used a phrase that I had not heard before and that I have thought about since. He said, "The field is where it's real. The office is where they think it's real. The job is getting the line between them to carry the truth in both directions." The field line. The line between the field and the office that had to carry truth in both directions. That was the product. That was the entire product in one sentence. I wrote it on the wall of my garage the night I started. It is still there. The wall is in my workshop in Nashville now, because when I moved, I had that section of drywall removed and reinstalled in the new workshop, which Patricia told me was the most specific thing I had ever done, and which I told her was simply accurate historical documentation. The garage years were not what my family imagined. When people heard garage years later, after the IPO, they imagined something romantic. The lone founder in the darkness, living on ramen, sacrificing everything, the heroic origin story that business press loved to tell. It was not romantic. It was repetitive and uncertain, and occasionally genuinely frightening in the way that working without a salary when you have a mortgage becomes frightening at specific intervals during the year. I had bought a small house in 2000, the year before I left the tech job. A one-story brick house with a detached garage on a quiet street in a Louisville neighborhood not far from where I had grown up. I had put 20% down and had a manageable mortgage payment that my tech company's salary had covered easily. After I left the tech company, the mortgage was covered by the savings for 6 months, and then by consulting work I took on the side for the following 2 years while building Fieldline simultaneously. The consulting work was the thing that kept me honest. Not just financially, professionally. Every consulting client I took was a construction company, and every hour I spent in their offices and on their sites was an hour of continuing education in the problem I was trying to solve. I saw new variations of the information flow problem. I saw solutions that companies had attempted that had not worked and why. I saw the specific ways that existing software tools fell short of the actual need. I brought everything back to the garage. The product changed constantly in the first 2 years. Not the core purpose. The core purpose was Douglas Merritt's sentence always, but the specific features, the specific interface, the specific architecture. I built versions and tore them down. I showed prototypes to people I trusted who worked in construction, and I listened to what they said and I rebuilt. My mother came to the house on Sunday evenings for dinner. She never asked how it was going in the way that contained the subtext of, "Are you sure about this?" She asked how it was going in the way that she asked her students how they were doing, which was with genuine curiosity about the specific thing in front of her. I told her. She listened. She did not always understand the technical detail, but she always understood the shape of what I was describing, and she always asked the question that cut to the core of it. One Sunday evening in 2003, 2 years into the garage, she said, "Is it working?" I said, "The software is working. I don't have a customer yet." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I've been building before selling, which is probably backwards, but I needed to know the product was real before I asked someone to pay for it." She said, "Is it real?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then go sell it." Monday morning, I called 3 construction companies. 2 of them said they would look at a demo. One of them, a small residential builder in the Louisville area called Thornton Homes, looked at the demo and said yes. First customer. First dollar. The dollar was small. Thornton Homes paid $250 a month for the software license. It was the most important $250 I had ever received. Not because of the amount. Because of the proof. Someone had looked at what I built and decided it was worth paying for. The garage was real. The Thanksgiving in 2009 was 8 years into the garage. 8 years. By that point, Fieldline had 47 customers, monthly recurring revenue of just over $31,000, 3 employees, all working remotely because I did not yet have an office. The product had grown significantly from the original version, adding modules for scheduling, budgeting, and subcontractor management that the customers had requested, and that I had built because the customers' requests were the most accurate specification document available. I was not rich. I was not comfortable in the way Kevin had his comfort calculated. I was, by the numbers, managing, paying the mortgage, paying my employees, paying myself a salary that was modest by the standards of what I had earned at the tech company, and that I was willing to accept because the company was growing and the growth required reinvestment. Kevin saw the modest salary. Kevin saw the home office. Kevin saw a man who had been in his garage for 8 years and who was still, by the external markers that Kevin used to evaluate professional success, behind where Kevin himself was. Kevin saw a younger version of himself if he had made a different and worse choice. He was wrong about all of this, but he did not know he was wrong. He was working from incomplete information. Just like Tyler Cole had been working from incomplete information, though at this point in the story Tyler Cole did not exist, and Marcus Webb was sitting at a Thanksgiving table in Louisville being told by his brother that he was wasting his life. I said one word. Okay. I went back to the garage. My mother had heard Kevin's speech. She had not intervened during it. This was deliberate. Dorothy Webb did not intervene in adult conversations at the dinner table when the person being spoken about was capable of responding. She raised us to be capable of responding. After dinner, when the cleanup was happening and Kevin and his wife were in the living room and Patricia was helping with dishes, my mother found me in the kitchen. She did not say, "Kevin was wrong." She did not say, "I am proud of you." She said, "How many customers do you have?" I said, 47. She said, "Are they happy?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Is it growing?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then that's the answer to his question." I said, "He didn't ask a question." She said, "He did, he just didn't phrase it as one." She dried a dish. She said, "The answer is 47 and growing. Remember that." I did. For 10 more years, I remembered it. And every year, the number got larger. And the answer got more complete. Subscribe right now and ring that notification bell. Point 2 is where Fieldline starts to become something that Kevin had no framework for understanding. This is where the building becomes the empire. Stay here. The year after the Thanksgiving speech, I hired my 4th employee. Her name was Rachel Torres. She was 28 years old and had a background in both construction project management and software product design, which was the specific combination that was almost impossible to find and that I had been looking for since I started, because the people who understood construction and the people who understood software were almost never the same people. Rachel was both. I found her through a former Hartley construction colleague who had stayed in touch and who knew what I was building and who had called me one afternoon and said, "I know someone you need to meet." I met Rachel at a coffee shop in Louisville on a Wednesday morning. She showed up 7 minutes early. She had already downloaded and used the Fieldline demo version. She had 3 pages of notes. Not complaints, observations. The specific observations of someone who had been on construction job sites and who had looked at the software interface from that perspective, and who had ideas about what the interface was assuming about the user that the user's actual situation did not support. I read all 3 pages while she sat across from me. I said, "How long did it take you to write these?" She said, "About 2 hours. I spent another hour using the product first." I said, 3 hours total. She said, "Yes." I said, "That's more time than most people spend understanding any product before they criticize it." She said, "I wasn't criticizing." I said, "I know, that's why I'm hearing you." She said, "You haven't told me the salary yet." I told her the salary. It was modest. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Can I ask what equity looks like?" I said, "Tell me what you think is fair and we'll talk about it." She told me what she thought was fair. I told her what I thought was fair. We agreed on a number that was between the two. Rachel Torres was with Fieldline from that Wednesday morning in 2010 until the day of the IPO in 2019, at which point her equity stake was worth just over $3 million. She is now the Chief Product Officer. She deserves every dollar and then some. The years between 2010 and 2014 were the years that the outside of the story did not change much, but the inside changed completely. Kevin's version of the story, based on what he saw from the outside, was that his brother was still in his home office with a small software company that was still small. What Kevin did not see was the inside. The inside was this. In 2010, Fieldline had 47 customers paying an average of $350 a month. In 2011, we had 91 customers paying an average of $420 a month. In 2012, we had 163 customers paying an average of $510 a month. In 2013, we had 248 customers paying an average of $630 a month. In 2014, we had 371 customers paying an average of $780 a month. The growth was not dramatic in the way that technology press described growth. It was not a hockey stick. It was a consistent upward line, month after month, driven entirely by the product doing what it said it would do and customers who used it telling other customers about it. Construction was, and remains, an industry built on relationships. The people who made decisions about tools and vendors were connected to each other in ways that made word of mouth both more powerful and more trustworthy than in industries where the relationships were thinner. A foreman who used Fieldline and liked it told the foreman at the next company. A project manager who trusted it recommended it to a project manager at a different firm. An owner who watched his team's efficiency improve told the owner he had dinner with about it. I did not have a marketing budget. I had satisfied customers. The two were, in the construction world, more or less equivalent. By 2014, Fieldline's monthly recurring revenue was just under $290,000, $3.5 million annualized. I had moved out of the home office and into actual office space. 6 employees full-time plus 2 contractors. An office in a building in downtown Louisville that had real windows and a conference room, and a kitchen with a coffee machine that worked reliably, which was the specific detail that my team had unanimously identified as the most important infrastructure upgrade. I was paying myself a real salary. Not a large one by the standards of what the company was worth, but a real one. My mortgage was comfortable. The truck was paid off. I wore the same clothes. Kevin still asked the question. Not at Thanksgiving. Kevin had learned, after 2009, not to make speeches at the table, but in the one-on-one conversations that happened between brothers when you saw each other at family events, the question was still in the air. It took different forms. In 2011, you doing okay financially? Because Mom mentioned you were busy and I just wanted to make sure you weren't stretched too thin. In 2012, how many customers do you have now? A few dozen. That's good. That's a solid base for something like what you're doing. In 2013, have you thought about getting a real job alongside this, just as a safety net? The software market is unpredictable. In 2014, look, I'm not saying it's not working. I'm just saying at some point you have to be honest with yourself about the ceiling. I answered each of these the same way. Directly, without performance. I gave him the number. Every time. He heard the number, and he did not have a framework for understanding what the number meant, because the number was not the kind of number that looked impressive in the context he was using to evaluate it, which was the context of a stable salaried job with benefits. $3.5 million in annual recurring revenue sounds like a lot, until you subtract the team costs and the infrastructure costs and the reinvestment requirements, and what remains is a founder's salary that is good but not spectacular. Kevin was evaluating my take-home pay. He was not evaluating the asset. The asset was a different number. The asset was the thing that was going to produce the number on the Wall Street screen in March of 2019. But Kevin did not evaluate assets. He evaluated income. Income was legible to him. Assets required a different kind of looking. The first time someone offered to invest in Fieldline was in 2013. A small venture fund based in Chicago called Meridian Ventures, which had a specific focus on software companies serving what they called legacy industries, meaning industries that had historically been underserved by technology. Construction was on their list. A partner at Meridian named Elaine Cho had heard about Fieldline through a connection in the Chicago construction market and had called me cold. I want to be specific about this call because it is the moment that the shape of the story changed. Elaine called on a Tuesday morning. She said, "Mr. Webb, I understand you've built a project management software platform for the construction industry and that you've grown it to almost 300 customers without any outside capital." I said, "That's correct." She said, "I'd like to understand how." She asked good questions. The specific questions of someone who understood software businesses and who was trying to understand why this one had grown the way it had grown. I answered all of them. At the end of the call, which lasted 47 minutes, she said, "Mr. Webb, we'd like to come meet you." I said, "I'm in Louisville." She said, "We'll come to you." They came the following week. Elaine and 2 of her partners sat in my conference room for 3 hours. They talked to me. They talked to Rachel. They looked at the product. They looked at the customer retention numbers, which were the most important numbers in any recurring revenue business, and which in Fieldline's case were extraordinary in a specific and defensible way. Once a construction company integrated Fieldline into its daily operations, the cost and disruption of switching to anything else was so high that almost nobody left. Our annual churn rate was under 4%. For context, the industry average for software companies serving similar markets was between 12 and 18%. Elaine looked at this number. She said, 4% annual churn. I said, yes. She said, how? I said, because we built for the way construction actually works, not the way people who have never been on a job site imagine it works. Once a company is on the platform knows their business. Switching means losing that institutional knowledge. Nobody wants to lose that. She looked at Rachel. Rachel said, the product learns the company's specific patterns over time. Their subcontractors, their suppliers, their scheduling rhythms. After 6 months on the platform, a company's Fieldline account is essentially a digital record of how they operate. There's no off-the-shelf replacement for that. Elaine looked at the numbers again. She said, what would you do with $2 million? I said 3 things. Hire 4 more developers, build out the mobile experience, enter the Texas market. She said, why Texas specifically? I said, because Texas has the second highest concentration of small and medium construction companies in the country. The weather allows year-round construction, which means year-round use. And I have 2 existing customers in Dallas who have already told me that if I had a Texas-based sales presence, they would refer me to 15 people immediately. Elaine said, you've been thinking about Texas. I said, I've been thinking about Texas for 2 years. I needed the capital to move. She said, we'd like to offer you $2 million for 15%. I said, $2 million for 12%. She looked at her partners. She looked back at me. She said, done. I shook her hand. That evening, I called my mother. I told her. She was quiet for a moment. She said, how many customers do you have? I said, almost 300. She said, and now you have money to get more. I said, yes. She said, good, are you eating? This was my mother. Investment round closed, and the first question was whether I was eating. I said, yes, Mom. She said, come for dinner Sunday. I went for dinner Sunday. She had made pot roast. I ate 2 plates. Kevin was not there that Sunday. Kevin was at his in-laws. I was glad. The Texas expansion changed the velocity of the company. Not the direction, the velocity. The direction had been set in the garage in 2001, when I wrote Douglas Merritt's sentence on the wall. But the Texas expansion, executed with the capital from Meridian Ventures and the 4 developers we hired in the 6 months after the investment, was the moment when Fieldline stopped being a growing company and started being a scaling company. Growing and scaling are different things. Growing is when your revenue goes up because you are doing more of the same things better. Scaling is when your revenue goes up faster than your costs because the system you have built is efficient enough to serve new customers without proportionally increasing the resources required to serve them. Fieldline had been growing since 2002. It started scaling in 2014. I hired a sales director named James Park in the fall of 2014. He was 36, had built sales teams at 2 previous software companies, and had the specific quality of a salesperson that I had found was rare in my experience. He genuinely believed in what he was selling. He had used Fieldline at a previous job. He had looked at it from the user side. He had called me. He said, I want to sell this. I said, tell me why. He described the experience of using the product from the field side. He had been a project coordinator at a construction company for 2 years before moving into software sales. He had specific memories of the information gap problem and specific experiences of how Fieldline had narrowed it. I said, "What did you earn at your last job?" He told me. I said, "I can do that plus equity." He said, "What percentage?" I said, 1%. He said, 1.5. I said, 1.25. He said, "Deal." James Park built the sales team that took Fieldline from 300 customers to over 2,000 in 4 years. 1.25% of a $53 million company is $662,500. He earned every dollar of it. The product evolution in those 4 years was driven primarily by Rachel and the development team, and I want to spend some time on this because the product is the thing, and the product evolution is the story of a team that understood the problem deeply enough to keep solving it as the problem changed. Construction technology had been a quiet backwater when I started in 2001. By 2015, it was starting to attract attention. The big software companies that had previously decided the market was too complex to serve were noticing the growth numbers. 2 venture-backed startups had launched products targeting the same general space. There was a new category emerging in the technology press called construction tech. My team noticed all of this. We had a meeting in late 2015 that I think about as the most important meeting in the company's history, not because of what was decided, but because of how the decision was made. Rachel had put together an analysis of the 2 new competitors. She had done what I had done with the broken radio when I was 8 years old. She had taken them apart. She had mapped every feature they had, and every feature Fieldline had, and every feature that construction companies had requested that neither had. She had put this on a whiteboard. The right side of the whiteboard was labeled, "What they have that we don't." The left side was labeled, "What we have that they don't." The middle was labeled, "What nobody has yet." The middle was the largest section. Rachel said, "This is where we should spend the next 18 months. I looked at the middle section. She had identified 4 features that no existing product addressed adequately, and that our customer conversations had consistently surfaced as pain points. Real-time materials cost tracking, integrated with supplier invoicing. Automated schedule adjustment when materials delays were entered. Cross-job resource allocation that allowed project managers to see availability across multiple active jobs simultaneously. Client-facing progress reporting that updated automatically from field data without requiring a separate reporting step. These 4 features were individually useful. Together, they were something different. Together, they were the thing that separated a project management tool from an operational intelligence platform. I said, "How long to build all 4? Rachel said, 12 months if we prioritize them exclusively. I said, "What do we pause?" She had already thought about this. She told me. We paused 3 features that were in the development queue that were nice to have rather than need to have. We started building the 4 in January 2016. We released them in November 2016. The release generated the first press coverage Fieldline had ever received. A trade publication in the construction industry called The Update the most significant advancement in job site management software in the past 5 years. It was not hyperbole. 214 new customers signed in the 4 months after the release. The velocity was real. Kevin's commentary during these years had shifted from concern to something that was harder to name. Not quite pride. Kevin was not built for uncomplicated pride in his older brother's work when that work had contradicted his assessment so thoroughly. Not quite acknowledgement. Acknowledging the growth would have required acknowledging the speech. It was more like a careful recalibration of his public position. At the Christmas in 2015, Kevin had said, "How's the software company?" I had said, "Growing." He had said, "That's good, that's really good." He had said it with the specific quality of someone who was adjusting their register in response to new information, without wanting to be seen adjusting. At the family Easter in 2016, after the 4-feature release, his question had been, "How many customers now?" I had said, "About 1,000. He had said, "Wow." Just that word. No qualification. No context. Wow. It was the first time in 15 years that Kevin had said something about the company that did not contain a layer of concern beneath it. My mother had been in the kitchen when this exchange happened. She had come to the doorway. She had not said anything. She had looked at me. She had nodded once. The nod was a complete sentence. The second investment round came in 2017. This time it was not Meridian Ventures alone. Meridian led the round and brought in 2 co-investors. The round was $7 million at a valuation that I am going to state plainly. The valuation was $19 million. I owned, after the dilution, approximately 58% of a company that was valued at $19 million. My stake was worth $11 million on paper. This was a paper number. The real number would come later. But it was a number that existed, and that my accountant and my attorney were very aware of, and that the outside world was not aware of because I had not published it and had not discussed it in public, and had not changed any of the visible things about my life, because the paper number was not money until the liquidity event, and the liquidity event had not happened yet. Kevin did not know this number. He had not asked. He was not in the room when the number was generated. He was in his office in Louisville doing what he did every day, which was excellent accountancy work for a firm that valued his precision and his reliability, and that had promoted him appropriately over the years. He was comfortable. He was comfortable in the way he had always measured comfort. He was not aware that his older brother, the one who had been wasting his life in the garage, was sitting on a paper stake worth $11 million that was growing every month, and that was going to become a very different kind of number in approximately 2 years. The third and final thing I want to tell you about in this section is my mother. Dorothy Webb had been coming to Sunday dinner since I was 31. Not every Sunday, but most Sundays, for 17 years. She had watched the garage years and the early customers and the Rachel hearing and the Texas expansion and the investment rounds. She had watched all of it from the specific vantage point of Sunday dinner, which was not the vantage point of a board member or an investor or a journalist, but the vantage point of a mother who was paying attention to her son. She had never once in 17 years said the words "I told you so" in any form. She had not said it about Kevin's speech. She had not said it about any of the specific moments where what I had built had proven itself in ways that answered the questions that had been asked about it. She had never said it because she had never needed to. She had simply asked the questions. How many customers do you have? Are they happy? Is it growing? Are you eating? These were the questions. In October of 2018, 5 months before the IPO, I went to Sunday dinner. I sat at the table. She made pot roast. I ate. At the end of dinner, she looked at me across the table. She said, "You're going to do something soon." I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you've been quiet in a different way for the past 2 months, the way you were quiet in the last few months before you left Hartley." I said, "We're filing to go public in January." She was quiet. She said, "What does that mean for you?" I said, "It means the paper number becomes real." She said, "How real?" I told her. She looked at her pot roast. She looked at me. She said, "Your grandfather built houses with his hands for 40 years. I said, "I know." She said, "He would not understand what you have done, but he would understand that you did it the way he did it." I said, "What way is that?" She said, "By knowing what you were building before you started, and not stopping until it was done." I looked at my mother, Dorothy Webb, 71 years old, still teaching as a substitute because she said full retirement was for people who had run out of things to be interested in and she had not. I said, "Thank you, Mom." She said, "Don't thank me, finish the pot roast." I finished the pot roast. Subscribe right now. Point 3 is the IPO, the Wall Street morning, the number on the screen, and the call that I made from that room in New York that set the rest of this story in motion. Stay here. The IPO process started in January of 2019. If you have never been through an IPO, I want to describe it accurately rather than romantically, because the romantic version that gets written about in business press is not the version that the people inside it experience. The IPO process is, in the most accurate possible description, the most thorough examination your company will ever undergo. Every number you have ever reported is looked at again. Every contract you have ever signed is reviewed. Every decision you have ever made that could be material to a public investor's understanding of the company's risk profile is documented, explained, and in some cases defended. Your team is interviewed. Your customers are surveyed. Your technology architecture is evaluated by people whose job is to find the things that could go wrong. I had prepared for this. Not perfectly. No one prepares for an IPO perfectly because the specificity of what is required cannot be fully anticipated from the outside. But substantially. For the 18 months preceding the January filing, I had been working with our CFO, a woman named Sandra Cho who had joined Fieldline in 2016 and who had spent her career in exactly this kind of work, to ensure that our financial reporting was audit-ready and that our operational documentation was complete and that the story of the company was told in the language that public markets required. Sandra was the person who first said the number to me. Not the exact number, which was determined by the market on the morning of the offering. The range that the investment bank we were working with had determined was achievable based on the company's financials and growth profile and market positioning. Sandra had come to my office on a Thursday in November 2018. She had closed the door. She had sat across from me. She had said, "Marcus, the bank thinks we can come out at a valuation between 48 and 62 million. I had looked at her. She had said, "That's not a typo." I had said, "I know." She had said, "That's your stake worth between $25 and $33 million. I had said, "I know." She had said, "Are you going to react to this at all?" I had thought about the garage, about the folding table, about the $14,000, about Kevin's fork. I had said, I went back to the garage the morning after Kevin said what he said. Every day after that I went back. The number on the screen is the result of the going back. It's not a surprise, it's a completion. Sandra had looked at me for a moment. She had said, "You are the strangest founder I have ever worked with." I had said, "Is that a compliment?" She had said, "Absolutely." The roadshow was 2 weeks in January. For those who do not know what a roadshow is, when a company is preparing to go public, the founders and key executives travel to meet with potential institutional investors, the funds and the asset managers, and the large investment firms that will decide whether to participate in the offering and at what price. Rachel came with me. James came with me. Sandra came with me. We spent 2 weeks in 10 cities meeting with investors for 8 to 10 hours a day, and presenting the field line story to rooms full of people whose job was to find the reasons not to invest and to make you explain why those reasons were insufficient. I had been in difficult rooms before. The construction companies in the early years who had looked at the demo and said not now. The investors who had passed before Meridian said yes. The customers who had tried the product and left, and the calls I made to each of them to understand exactly why. These rooms were different. Not harder, more precise. The questions were better than any questions I had received before. And the answers required the specific clarity that only comes from having built something and knowing it completely, and having no interest in saying anything about it that was not exactly true. I do not misrepresent things, not because of a moral framework that I maintain with effort, because I am constitutionally uninterested in the work required to maintain a misrepresentation over time. The truth is simpler. The truth is also, in most cases, more interesting. The truth about Fieldline was very interesting. 241 customers had been with the platform for more than 5 years. Average revenue per customer had grown every year for 6 consecutive years. The 4% churn rate. The organic growth percentage, meaning the proportion of new customers who had come through referral rather than paid marketing. The organic growth number was 73%. 73% of our customers had come because an existing customer told someone. One investor, a woman named Margaret Chen at a large asset management firm in Boston, had looked at the organic growth number and said, "How do you achieve 73% organic growth?" I had said, "You build something people love well enough to talk about." She had said, "That's not an operational answer." I had said, "The operational answer is, you build the product for the actual user in the actual situation, not the idealized user in the idealized situation. Construction foremen don't have time to navigate a complex interface. Construction owners don't want reports that require manual generation. We built for what they actually needed in the moment they actually needed it. When the product solves the real problem correctly, users tell people." Margaret Chen had written something in her notebook. She had looked up. She had said, "Mr. Webb, I'm in." She was one of 14 institutional investors who committed during the roadshow. The book was oversubscribed. The bank called on the last day of the roadshow. They said, "The demand supports the top of the range. We're pricing at $53 million. I said, "What does that mean for the offering?" They said, "We raised $21 million in fresh capital. Your personal stake, post-offering, is worth just under $30 million. I said, "Okay." They said, "Mr. Webb, that's a significant reaction to a significant number." I said, "I went back to the garage for 18 years. The number is the result. I'm glad it's a good number. I'm not surprised it's a number." March 14, 2019. The morning of the offering. We were in New York. I had slept well. This surprised Sandra, who told me over breakfast that she had not slept at all and that my calm was either a sign of deep psychological health or complete dissociation. I told her it was probably both. We were at the exchange for the opening. The team was there. Rachel, James, Sandra, 6 other Fieldline employees who had been with the company long enough that the moment belonged to them as much as it belonged to me. We watched the opening. The symbol went up. The price went up. By mid-morning, the valuation was settled. $53,400,000. I stood in that room and looked at the screen. I thought about my father on the dock. I thought about Roy and the filing system. I thought about Frank DeLuca's memory being the single most fragile part of the operation. I thought about Douglas Merritt saying the field is where it's real. I thought about the folding table in the garage in 2001. I thought about Kevin's fork. Rachel was standing next to me. She said, "Marcus." I said, "Yes." She said, "We did it." I said, "You did most of it." She said, "You started it." I said, "That's the easiest part." She shook her head. She said, "It really isn't." I smiled. The room was celebrating around us. James was shaking hands with investors. Sandra was on the phone. I took out my phone. I made one call. My mother answered on the second ring. She said, "Marcus." I said, "Mom, it closed." She said, "How many customers?" I laughed. I actually laughed. Standing on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange on the morning of my company's IPO, with $30 million worth of stock in my name, and my mother asked how many customers. I said, 2,046. She said, "And are they happy?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Is it growing?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good, come for dinner Sunday." I said, "I'll be there." She said, "Pot roast." I said, "Perfect." She said, "I love you." I said, "I love you too." She hung up. I stood in the room. Rachel was watching me. She said, "Who was that?" I said, "My mother." She said, "What did she say?" I said, "She asked how many customers and whether they were happy." Rachel looked at me. She said, "She sounds remarkable." I said, "She is the most remarkable person I know." James came over. He said, "Marcus, drinks tonight." I said, "Yes." He said, "Where?" I said, "Somewhere that makes good pot roast." He looked at me. He said, "I don't think that's what drinks usually means." I said, "It's what it means tonight." The weeks after the IPO were not what most people imagined. People imagined celebration. There was celebration. There was the dinner in New York with the team that ran until 2 in the morning, and that was one of the best evenings of my professional life, for the specific reason that every person at that table had given years of their actual life to building something, and the something had proven itself in a way that the market had confirmed. But after the celebration, there was work. The company was now public. Public companies had requirements that private companies did not. Reporting requirements, governance requirements, the specific obligations of an organization that was now accountable to shareholders in ways that required ongoing attention. I was back in the office on Monday. Same office, same desk, same coffee, same clothes. Sandra had looked at me when I walked in Monday morning. She had said, "I expected you to look different somehow." I had said, "I don't feel different." She had said, "Not even a little." I had thought about it. I had said, "The number is real now instead of theoretical. That's different. Everything else is the same problem." She had said, "What problem?" I had said, "How do we serve the next customer the same way we served the first one?" She had shaken her head. She had said, "You are definitely the strangest founder I have ever worked with." I had sat down. I had opened my laptop. I had gone to work. Kevin called on the Thursday after the IPO. Not the Monday, the Thursday. I found this specific. He had heard about the IPO from someone, not from me, from someone who had read the business press coverage and had called Kevin and told him. Kevin called on Thursday. He said, "Marcus." I said, "Kevin." He said, "I heard about the company." I said, "Yes." He said, 50 million. I said, 53. He said, "That's incredible." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I had no idea it had gotten that big." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have." He stopped. I said, "Kevin." He said, "Yeah." I said, "It's okay." He said, I said some things over the years. I said, you said what you understood at the time. He said, that doesn't make it right. I said, no, it doesn't, but it makes it human. He was quiet. He said, I owe you an apology. I said, save it for Sunday. Mom is making pot roast. He said, is she? I said, she makes it every Sunday. He said, I'll be there. He came. We ate pot roast. He apologized in the way that Kevin apologized, which was directly and without excessive ornamentation. I accepted it in the way that I accepted things, which was simply and completely. We did not talk about the speech or the years of concern or the forks at Thanksgiving tables. We talked about the company. He asked questions. Real ones. The questions of a man who was genuinely trying to understand something that had been right in front of him for 18 years that he had not understood. I answered all of them. My mother sat at the end of the table and ate her pot roast and did not say a single word about being right. She did not need to. Subscribe right now. Point 4 is where the door knocks. 3 weeks after the IPO, Kevin with a list, and me with something I had been preparing longer than he knew. 3 weeks after the IPO, on a Saturday morning in April, someone knocked on my front door. I was in the workshop, working on a cabinet I had been building for the past 2 months. Not because I needed a cabinet, because building with my hands on Saturday mornings was the thing I had been doing since I was 8 years old, taking apart radios. And it was the thing that kept me connected to the specific physical reality of making something that the desk work could not. I heard the knock through the workshop window. I put down the plane. I walked through the house to the front door. I opened it. Kevin was standing there. His wife, Linda, was beside him. My sister, Patricia, was behind them, which surprised me because I had not expected Patricia. Standing slightly to the side, in a way that communicated they were present but deferring to Kevin as the lead, were my Aunt Carol and her husband Dennis, who lived in Indianapolis and who had driven down, apparently, for this. 5 people on my front porch at 10 in the morning on a Saturday. I looked at them. I said, come in. They came in. I made coffee. I had a kitchen that worked and a coffee machine that was good, and I made a full pot because 5 people on a Saturday morning warranted a full pot. They sat in the living room. I sat across from them. There was a moment of the specific silence that happened before someone said the thing they had come to say. Kevin said it. He said, Marcus, we've been talking. I said, about what? He said, about the IPO, about the company, about the situation. I said, what situation? He shifted. He said, family situation. I said, tell me what you came to say, Kevin. He said, we were thinking, with the company going public, the kind of money you're working with now, we thought maybe there was an opportunity to talk about family, about what that means, about whether there's a way to share some of the good fortune. I looked at him. I said, share the good fortune. He said, as a family, we're family. Linda said, Kevin has always been there for you. I said, has he? She said, he's your brother. I said, I know who he is. My Aunt Carol said, Marcus, we're not asking for charity. We're talking about family support. Dennis has his situation with the medical bills. I said, Dennis. Dennis said, the back surgery, the insurance didn't cover. I said, I know about the surgery. Dennis said, I'm not asking for. I said, I know you're not asking for nothing. That's why you drove 4 hours. The room was quiet. Patricia had not said anything. She was sitting in the chair by the window looking at me in the way she had always looked at me, which was directly and without performing a position. I looked at her. She said, I'm here because Kevin asked me to come. I told him I wasn't going to ask you for anything. I said, I know. She said, but I'm your sister and I wanted to be here. I said, I'm glad you're here. Kevin said, Marcus, look, I know I said things over the years. I said, Kevin. He stopped. I said, I want to show you something. I stood up. I went to the study. I came back with a folder. A thick one. White paper, clean edges, the kind of folder that communicated organization. I sat down. I set the folder on the coffee table. I said, before anyone says anything else, I want to read something. Kevin said, what is that? I said, this is a document I have been building for approximately 18 years. I opened it. I said, I want to be clear about what this is. This is not an invoice in the legal sense. This is an accounting, a record. The thing I was told about my work over the years, from the people in this room, documented with dates and contexts. The room was very quiet. I looked at the first page. I said, Thanksgiving 2009. Kevin Webb to Marcus Webb at the family dinner table in the presence of Dorothy Webb, Patricia Webb, Carol and Dennis Hartley and Linda Cole Webb. Kevin said, Marcus. I said, I'm going to finish. I read the quote, word for word. The wasting your life speech. The room was absolutely silent. I turned the page. I said, Christmas dinner 2010. Kevin Webb to Marcus Webb, one-on-one conversation in the kitchen. Quote, are you doing okay financially because mom mentioned you were busy and I just wanted to make sure you weren't stretched too thin? Context. Fieldline had 63 paying customers and monthly recurring revenue of $22,000. Kevin said, I was worried about you. I said, I know. I'm not disputing your intent. I'm documenting the record. I turned the page. I continued. Every entry, every year, every variation of the concern that contained the subtext of you should do something more reliable than this. I read the 2011 entry. I read the 2012 entry. I read the 2013 entry. I read the 2014 entry, the ceiling comment. I read the 2016 entry from the Easter dinner, the one where Kevin had said wow and nothing else when I told him I had 1,000 customers. I read the 2017 entry, which was a phone call in which Kevin had said, do you have a good accountant? Because with outside investment involved, you want to make sure you're protecting yourself. I read the 2018 entry, which was the last one before the IPO, in which Kevin had said at the summer cookout, I just hope you're not getting too far ahead of yourself with all this. Tech companies can be volatile. I read every entry. It took 22 minutes. The room was completely silent for all 22 minutes. At the end, I closed the folder. I put it on the coffee table. I looked at Kevin. He was looking at the folder. His face had the specific quality of someone who was hearing their own voice, played back to them, in a context that made the voice sound different from how it had sounded when they were producing it. He said, Marcus. I said, I want you to understand something. This document is not a weapon. It is not a threat. It is not what I am handing you instead of a check. He said, then what is it? I said, it is evidence. He said, evidence of what? I said, evidence that the people in this room for 18 years did not believe in what I was building. Not because you were bad people, because you did not understand it, and because you chose, in every conversation, to express the non-understanding as concern rather than as curiosity. I looked at each of them in turn. Kevin, Linda, Aunt Carol, Dennis. I said, concern sounds like care. It feels like care. But concern that repeats itself over 18 years without ever becoming a question about what is actually happening is not care. It is a verdict. Kevin said, that's not fair. I said, you told me I was wasting my life at a Thanksgiving table in front of our mother. He said, I was worried. I said, you were certain. There's a difference. He was quiet. I said, Linda, you said this morning that Kevin has always been there for me. She said, he has. I said, when I hired my first employee, I called Kevin to tell him. Do you know what he said? She did not answer. I said, he said, just make sure you can afford her if the customers don't grow. Just make sure. I said, that is not being there for someone. That is managing someone's expectations toward your own comfort level. She was quiet. I looked at my aunt. I said, Carol, you mentioned Dennis's medical bills. She said, I didn't mean. I said, I know you didn't mean to phrase it as a transaction, but you drove 4 hours this morning. You got here at 10 a.m. on a Saturday. You drove because you heard the number. She was quiet. I looked at Dennis. He was looking at his hands. I said, Dennis, the back surgery. I know about it because my mother told me about it 3 months ago. I asked her at that time whether you needed help. She said you had it handled. You did not call me. He said, I didn't want to bother you. I said, you didn't call me because you didn't think of me as a resource 3 months ago. You're here today because the number changed. He was quiet. I said, this is what I want you to understand, all of you. I looked at Kevin last. I said, the number did not change who I am. I am the same person who was in the garage in 2001, the same person who was at the Thanksgiving table in 2009, the same person who went back to the garage the next morning. I said, what the number represents is 18 years of being exactly who I was in the face of every conversation that suggested I should be something more immediately legible. I said, and now you are here with a list of needs on a Saturday morning. Kevin said, I know how this looks. I said, tell me. He said, it looks like we didn't believe in you, and now we want something from you. I said, yes. He said, that's true. I said, I know. He said, Marcus, I am sorry for the speech, for every time I expressed concern the way I expressed it, for not asking different questions. He said it directly, without performance. This was Kevin, who was capable of directness when he was not hiding behind concern. I said, I know you are. I said, Patricia. She said, yes. I said, you didn't come here for anything. She said, no. I said, you've never asked me for anything. She said, you're my brother. I said, you've believed in this from the beginning. She said, I believed in you. That's different. I said, is it? She said, you could have built something that didn't work. I would have believed in you anyway. The 53 million wasn't the thing. I looked at my sister. I thought about the phone call the morning after the Thanksgiving speech. He doesn't understand what you're building. I said, I know. I looked at the room. I said, Dennis, your medical bills, send them to my accountant. I will cover the out-of-pocket costs, all of them. Dennis said, Marcus. I said, you didn't ask for anything in 3 months. You came today because Kevin asked you to. That means the 3 months of not asking was real. I honor that. He said, thank you. I said, Carol, is there anything you need specifically? She said, Marcus, we don't need. I said, is there anything? She said, the house needs a new roof. We've been putting it off. I said, send me the estimate. She said, you don't have to. I said, you are family. Family helps with roofs. That is not conditional on whether you believed in the garage. She said, thank you. I said, Kevin. He looked at me. I said, what did you come here to ask for? He said, I was going to ask if you would invest in something. I said, what something? He said, a rental property. I've been looking at a duplex. The return is solid. I was going to ask for a loan. I said, how much? He said, 150,000. I said, what's the property worth? He told me. I said, at that price the return is better than you think if you finance it differently. Send me the details. I'll look at it. He said, you'll look at it. I said, I'm not handing you a check. I'll look at it. He said, that's fair. I said, it's what I do. I look at things carefully and then I decide. He said, I know. He said, Marcus. I said, yes. He said, I should have asked questions instead of giving speeches. I said, yes, you should have. He said, can I ask them now? The questions I should have asked. I looked at my brother. Kevin Webb, 52 years old, good at his job, capable of directness when he chose it. The man who had told me I was wasting my life and who had been wrong in the most documentable possible way. He was asking if he could ask the questions now. 18 years later. I said, yes. He said, from the beginning. I said, from the beginning. He said, how did you know the market was there? I said, I worked in construction for 3 years before I built the software. I knew the market because I had been inside it. He said, why didn't you tell me that? When I said what I said in 2009, why didn't you just explain all of this? I thought about this. I said, because explanation requires an audience that is asking. You weren't asking, you were statting. He was quiet. He said, I was statting. I said, yes. He said, I'm asking now. I said, I know. I told him the whole story. From the construction years to Frank DeLuca to Douglas Merritt's sentence on the garage wall to Rachel Torr's 3 pages of notes to James Park and the Texas expansion and the 4 features that nobody else had built and the 4% churn rate and Margaret Chen saying she was in. He listened. For 2 hours, Kevin Webb listened to the story he had been adjacent to for 18 years and had never fully heard. At the end, he was quiet. He said, you knew the whole time. I said, I knew what I was building. I didn't know the exact number it would produce, but I knew the direction. He said, how? I said, the same way Dad knew to sit on the garage floor, the same way Mom knew to ask if the customers were happy, not because of a calculation, because I understood the problem well enough to know that the solution to it had value. He said, you sound like her. I said, I hope so. He said, she knew, didn't she, about all of it? I said, she asked the right questions. He said, I asked the wrong ones. I said, you asked the questions you had the framework for. You're asking different ones now. He said, is it too late? I said, for what? He said, for me to understand what you understand. I said, you're an accountant, Kevin. You understand numbers. The rest of what I do is just applied curiosity. You have the curiosity. You just aimed it at the wrong things. He said, the wrong things. I said, you were curious about whether I was okay. You should have been curious about what I was building. He said, what's the difference? I said, one is about protecting yourself from the discomfort of watching someone you love take a risk. The other is about actually understanding the risk they're taking. He was quiet. He said, I was protecting myself. I said, yes. He said, from what? I said, from the possibility that you had chosen the safer path when you could have chosen a different one. The room was very quiet. Kevin looked at his hands. He said, yeah. Just that. Yeah. I said, the duplex, send me the details. He said, okay. I said, and Kevin? He said, yeah. I said, come to dinner on Sunday. He said, Mom's. I said, Mom's. He said, she'll make pot roast. I said, she always makes pot roast. He said, okay. He came. They all came. Subscribe right now. Point 5 is the Sunday dinner, the one that happens after all of this. And it is the Sunday where I understood what the whole 18 years had actually been about. The Sunday after the Saturday was the last Sunday of April. It was warm enough to eat outside, which my mother had been threatening to do since March, and which she had not done because March in Louisville was not the warm Sunday of the threat. April was. She had set the table on the back porch. The pot roast was in the oven. I arrived at noon, which was the time that Sunday dinners at Dorothy Webb's house started, not because noon was stated, but because noon was understood and had been understood since we were children, and understanding was the currency of the household. Patricia was already there. She had driven from Columbus on Saturday evening and had stayed in her old room, which was still her old room in the way that childhood bedrooms in parents' houses were still the rooms of the children who had lived in them regardless of how much time had passed. Kevin arrived at 12:05. Linda was with him. Aunt Carol and Dennis were not there. They had driven back to Indianapolis after the Saturday meeting. I had called Dennis on Sunday morning before leaving the house and had told him to send the medical bills to Sandra's office. He had said thank you 4 times. I had told him once was enough. My mother was in the kitchen. I went to help. She said, "Sit down." I said, "I can help." She said, "You can help by sitting down. The pot roast doesn't need 2 people." I sat down at the kitchen table. The kitchen table where I had sat 1,000 Sunday mornings, where she had helped me with the homework and made the lunches and asked the questions and listened to the answers. She was at the counter. She said, "How did yesterday go?" I said, "Kevin came." She said, "I know, he called me last night." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said you read them a document." I said, "Yes." She said, "Every insult." I said, "Every entry." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Was it what you thought it would be?" I said, "I didn't do it to be what I thought it would be. I did it because it was the most accurate thing I could show them." She said, "What did Kevin say when you finished reading?" I said, "He apologized." She said, "Did you believe him?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because he asked the questions after. He asked me to explain from the beginning. He listened for 2 hours." She said, "Kevin doesn't listen to things for 2 hours." I said, "I know." She said, "That means he meant the apology." I said, "I know." She turned from the counter. She looked at me. She said, "Marcus, can I tell you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Kevin was afraid of you." I said, "Afraid of me?" She said, "Not in the way of being scared, in the way of watching someone go somewhere he couldn't follow and not knowing what to do with that." I said, "That's not a reason to say what he said." She said, "No, it's not, but it's the explanation." I said, "He chose the safer path." She said, "He chose the path that felt right to him at the time. And then he spent 18 years watching you go a different direction and not being able to admit that the different direction might also be right." I said, "Because then his path might also not be right." She said, "Yes." I said, "That's what I told him." She said, "I know, he told me." She turned back to the counter. She said, "Your father had a word for that, for the thing Kevin was doing." I said, "What word?" She said, "He called it loud worry. He said loud worry is what you do when you're scared for someone and you don't know how to be quiet about it." I said, "Dad said that." She said, "About you, when you left the tech company." I was quiet. She said, "He was scared when you left the tech company. He called me the day after you told us. He said, 'Dorothy, do you think he knows what he's doing?' I said, 'What did you say?' She said, 'I said yes.' I said, 'How did you know?' She said, Because you sounded the same way you sounded the morning before you left for Hartley, and the morning before you left Hartley, and every morning before every hard thing you have ever done. I said, how did I sound? She said, like you already knew where you were going, like the decision was already made and you were just doing the steps. I said, Dad was scared. She said, he was always scared for you. He never said it to you because he knew the scared was his problem and not yours. I said, he should have told me. She said, he showed you instead. I said, when? She said, every time he sat on the garage floor. I was quiet. I thought about my father on the concrete floor, with the components of the broken radio spread between us. What do you understand so far? He had been scared for me. He had sat on the floor anyway. He had asked the question instead of the speech. I said, Mom. She said, yes. I said, Kevin asked the question on Saturday, not the speech, the question. She said, I know. I said, that's the difference. She said, yes. I said, is it enough? She said, is what enough? I said, the question after the speech, after 18 years. She said, the question is always enough, if it's real. I said, how do you know if it's real? She said, you listen to what comes after it. I said, what came after Kevin's question on Saturday was 2 hours of listening. She said, then it was real. She took the pot roast out of the oven. It smelled exactly the way it had smelled every Sunday of my adult life. I said, Mom. She said, yes. I said, the 53 million, what do you think it means? She put the pot roast on the counter. She looked at it for a moment. She said, it means the 47 customers became 2,046, and the 2,046 were happy, and it grew. She looked at me. She said, it means your grandfather built his houses, and your father operated his press and his evening clients, and you built your software, and each of those things was real work done by a real person who understood what they were building. She said, the number is the evidence, it's not the thing. I said, what's the thing? She said, the thing is that you went back to the garage the morning after. I said, that's what you always say. She said, because it's always true. She set the table. Patricia came in from the living room. She said, can I help? Dorothy said, you can carry the rolls. Patricia carried the rolls. Kevin came in. He said, smells incredible. Dorothy said, it always smells the same. He said, I know, I just forget between Sundays. She said, that's why you come every Sunday. He sat down. Linda sat beside him. I sat across. Patricia sat at the corner. Dorothy sat at the head. The pot roast was on the table. The rolls were on the table. The Sunday light was coming through the windows in the specific way. It came through windows in Louisville in April, warm and certain, and indifferent to the specific human things happening in the rooms it entered. Dorothy said, Marcus. I said, yes. She said, say grace. I had not said grace at this table since I was 17 years old. I looked at her. She looked back. I said, I'll try. I bowed my head. I said, thank you for the food. Thank you for the people around the table. Thank you for the work, for the ability to do it and the years to do it in and the problem that was worth doing it for. I paused. I said, and thank you for the garage floor. Patricia said, Amen. Kevin said, Amen. Dorothy said, Amen. We ate. The duplex conversation had an outcome. Kevin sent me the details the following week. I looked at the numbers, which were what Kevin had described solid. He had done the analysis correctly. The property was undervalued relative to the rental income potential, and the neighborhood trajectory supported appreciation. I told him I would loan him the 150,000 at 3% interest over 10 years. He said the bank would charge me more. I said, I know. He said, why 3%? I said, because family shouldn't be free and shouldn't be punitive. 3% is respectful of both. He said, that's very specific. I said, most things worth doing are specific. He bought the duplex. He manages it himself. He calls me occasionally with questions about property management that are actually pretty good questions. I answer them. He is learning something new. At 52 years old, Kevin Webb is learning to ask questions about something he does not already understand. This is the most important thing that has happened to him professionally in a decade. I did not say this to him, but Patricia said it to me when I told her. She said, you know what's interesting about Kevin lately? I said, what? She said, he calls me to ask about my business, not to check if I'm okay, to actually ask. I said, when did that start? She said, the week after your Saturday meeting. I said, that's interesting. She said, you unlocked something. I said, what did I unlock? She said, the part of him that wanted to understand things instead of just evaluate them. I said, he had that the whole time. She said, he had it aimed wrong. I said, yes. She said, Marcus. I said, yes. She said, the document, the insult bill. I said, yes. She said, you didn't actually hand it to them as a bill. I said, no. She said, you just read it. I said, yes. She said, why read it instead of just talking? I said, because I needed them to hear it in a form that could not be interrupted. Every entry, every year, the full record. She said, and then you helped them anyway. I said, yes. She said, Dennis and Carol, the roof and the medical bills. I said, yes. She said, and Kevin and the duplex. I said, yes. She said, after all of that. I said, yes. She said, why? I said, because they're family. She said, even after everything. I said, the document wasn't revenge, Patricia, it was a record. There's a difference. She said, what's the difference? I said, revenge would have been not helping. The document was clarity. They needed to understand what the 18 years looked like from my side before they could understand why the help was still available. She said, that's very specific thinking. I said, most things worth doing are specific. She laughed. She said, you say that a lot. I said, because it's always true. She said, Marcus. I said, yes. She said, I believed in you from the beginning, not because I knew it was going to be 53 million, because you sounded like you knew where you were going. I said, same thing Mom said. She said, we're women who pay attention. I said, yes, you are. She said, was it worth it, the 18 years? I said, the years were the thing, not the number. If the number had been different, the years would have been the same years. She said, what if the number had been 0? I said, then the years would have been wrong years done for the right reasons. She said, you'd still be in the garage. I said, probably. She said, building something. I said, yes. She said, that's either admirable or stubborn. I said, Mom says both. She said, she's right about both. My mother had a word for the thing that Kevin had been doing, and that my aunt and Dennis had been doing, and that most of the people who did not understand what I was building had been doing. She called it measuring from the outside. She said it at dinner one Sunday in 2020, a year after the IPO, when we were talking about something unrelated, and she had connected it to something I had not thought to connect it to. She said, the people who measured you from the outside were measuring what they could see. They were not wrong about what they saw. They were wrong about what they didn't see. I said, what didn't they see? She said, the inside, the mechanism, the 47 customers who became 2,000, the field line between the ground and the office. She said they couldn't see it because they had never sat on the garage floor. I said, and you? She said, I asked the questions. I said, the right questions. She said, how many customers are they happy? Is it growing? I said, those 3. She said, and are you eating? I said, that one too. She said, those are the only questions that matter for any business. I said, they are also the only questions that matter for a life. She looked at me. She said, yes. She said, how many people do you love? I said, a few. She said, are they happy? I said, mostly. She said, is it growing? I said, yes. She said, are you eating? I said, 2 plates. She said, then everything is exactly right. She got up and made more coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. The same table. The same kitchen. The same Sunday. I thought about the garage. About the folding table and the $14,000 and the broken radio on the concrete floor. About Douglas Merritt's sentence on the wall. About Rachel and James and Sandra and 2,046 customers who were happy and it was growing. About Kevin's fork. About one word. Okay. And going back to the garage. And going back. And going back. And going back. Until the number on the screen was real. And then going back on Monday. So that is Marcus Webb. 54 years old. Nashville, Tennessee. Regular truck, regular clothes, black coffee. Workshop on Saturday mornings. Pot roast on Sundays. Let me say the thing at the center of all of this, because the 53 million and the IPO and the Wall Street morning are satisfying, but they are the evidence, not the story. The story is one word. Okay. Kevin stood at a Thanksgiving table in 2009 and told me I was wasting my life in front of the people I loved. I said okay. And I went back to the garage. Not because I was certain the number would be 53 million. Not because I had a plan that guaranteed the outcome. Because I knew the problem was real. I had been on the job sites. I had talked to the foremen and the project managers and the owners. I had watched the information flow between the ground and the office, and I had understood, in the specific physical way of a person who had been on the ground, exactly where it was failing and exactly what a solution would look like. That was the whole thing. Know the problem. Build for the real user and the real situation. Deliver what you said you would deliver. Go back in the morning. Repeat. For 18 years. The 53 million is what 18 years of that looks like when the problem you chose was the right problem, and the solution you built was the right solution, and the market confirmed what you already knew. Kevin did not understand the problem. He understood income. He did not understand assets. He did not understand that the $247 a month from customer number 1 was the beginning of a compounding story that would eventually require a number on a New York screen to make visible. He understood what he could see. He measured from the outside. He was not wrong about what he saw. He was wrong about what he did not see. The document was not revenge. The document was the inside made visible. Every entry, every year, every Tuesday morning he expressed concern when he should have expressed curiosity. I read all of it. And then I helped with the roof, and the medical bills, and the duplex, because that is what the garage was for. Not the 53 million, not the number on the screen. The ability to help with the roof, to cover the medical bills, to loan money to a brother at 3% because family should not be free and should not be punitive. That is what 18 years of going back in the morning produces. Not the wealth, the capability, the specific ability to look at the people you love and say, I have the resources to help, and you are worth helping. And the fact that you did not believe in me does not change the fact that I believe in family. That is the $53 million. Not a number, a capacity. My mother understood this from the first Sunday dinner. She asked if the customers were happy. She asked if it was growing. She asked if I was eating. She never asked how much money was in the account, because she knew that the money in the account was the result of the other things being true. Get the customers. Keep them happy. Grow. Eat. The rest follows. Like this video right now. If you have ever gone back to your garage, your desk, your studio, your kitchen, your whatever it is, the morning after someone told you that you were wasting your time, hit that button. That is who this story is for. Subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell, because every single week there is a story here about what the inside looks like when the outside does not make sense yet. We are not going anywhere. Share this video with someone who is in their garage right now. Someone who is in year 3 or year 7 or year 12 of building something that the people around them do not fully understand. Send it to them. Let them see year 18. Comment below and tell me your one word. The word you said after someone told you that your thing was not worth doing. Tell me what the word was and what you did the next morning. We read every single comment. Everyone matters. This is the channel. This is the story. Go back to the garage. The morning always comes. And the pot roast is on Sunday. We will see you.